Okay, I've decided to start recording this lecture. It is Econ 300, Contemporary Economic Issues, and it is also Earth Day, April 22nd, 2021. And I have posted an article in Blackboard called, "Why Has Climate Economics Failed Us?" And the point of the article, I encourage you to read it. I think I put optional reading. The word optional means I'm not going to quiz you directly over the contents of that reading, but I still encourage you to do it. It may help you with the quiz, even if it's not directly asking you questions about it. But the point is that economics has not particularly been focused on this sort of long-term effects of the economy on the climate, and what sort of this question of, given that we need to do something, what's the best way to do it? And he accuses us of having siloism, where everyone's working just on their own little thing. This is true. I will admit this is correct. Economists, by their nature, are people who have specialized in something, right? They've been trained to do something. I have been trained to work on questions like questions of behavioral economics and I would say applied game theory, and that's what my dissertation and my thesis when I got my PhD was in that. So then once I became a professor, and people say, okay, you're a professor, now go study whatever you want, and if it's good enough, we'll give you tenure. I chose to work on the sort of my own little silo that I specialized in. That's true. That is how economics works. And then there's not even a lot of incentive for economists to collaborate with people outside their field, because if you end up publishing something in a different field, it's not as valuable. If I work with a psychology person and we publish in psychology, it's not as good for me as if I published it in an economics journal. And then vice versa, if we publish in economics and this guy who's a psychologist is like, oh, that's worse for me to publish in an economics journal. That's part of siloism. So that's part of the point of this article. And I'm just curious, you guys didn't know to read it. I told you, maybe I told you I was gonna post it, but you didn't know it was there until now. But I am curious of what your thoughts are about what should the role of economics as a profession be to inform policymakers about questions that have to do with the climate. Because the beginning of this article says that the Biden administration is not listening to economists on this question. The Biden administration has like a climate, I forget what it's called, but like a panel, some sort of board that's working on deciding what to do to face the climate crisis. And there's really not a lot of economists on it. And you might say, well, that doesn't make sense. Aren't economists important? Don't you need their input? And it could be that the reason is we're not really addressing the big issues here, and we're not actually very helpful. That's why the title of the article is "Climate Economics Has Failed Us." Okay. Wasn't this case for a long time? Yeah. Pretty much yes, Nick. But what do you guys think about the whole climate crisis, given that it's Earth Day, and we don't want to end up like WALL-E? Those of you watching on YouTube, I started this lecture with the example of WALL-E. That's the case where life on Earth has become unsustainable. Humans cannot live on the planet Earth anymore. And it's not because of any natural disasters. It's not because of war. It's not because of disease. It's because of economics. It's because of the overconsumption and overproduction of goods in an unsustainable way. At least that's the impression that the movie gives you. The movie doesn't say exactly what happened to Earth, but what you see on Earth is the remnants of a capitalist society where corporations have a lot of power. You can tell their names everywhere, and there's garbage everywhere. There's just not the entire planet is surrounded with satellites and things which have basically stunted the natural process of the Earth. So it's not necessarily global warming. Did you guys get any impression that global warming was part of the issue in the Wall-E movie? Maybe, maybe not. They don't say.
It was possible. The world looked pretty like desolate, as in like not a lot of growth, anything's growing, but that may have
Right.
just been from all the pollution.
So there was a lot of desertification too.
Yeah.
Which actually is part of the climate crisis. It's not just about the temperature. I mean, today in Richmond, it's awfully cold. For late April, it's awfully cold. But the climate crisis is not just increasing temperatures. It's increasing the variance of temperatures and the strength of the storms and the acidification of the oceans and the et cetera. So on Earth Day, I do think it makes sense to talk about these things and whether or not economics has a lot to say about what we should be doing to correct them. What do you guys think? Any thoughts?
So I've read a little bit of the article so far, and it's almost as if he's saying that economists are almost ignoring climate change or not
Yeah.
taking it into very big account.
So
It's just
exactly. Yeah.
it's odd to me because like my first economics class I ever took, it talked about externalities, and like that the first example I was given was pollution and climate change, like the very first economics class I ever took.
Yes.
You talking like at a more advanced level, because it feels like
Yes.
climate change came right in it from the very beginning in my first economics class.
That's a great point, Philip. You're talking about economic instruction rather than economic research. And economists, we like probably a lot of people, we're very just sort of snobbish in terms of like good research versus not the good research. And it really, really, really depends on the quality of the journal. You can take the exact same paper, publish it in a crappy journal, and people will sort of dismiss it. Like that doesn't really matter. I'm not going to read it. I'm not going to pay attention. But if you put something in a good journal, one of those top journals, it immediately becomes relevant. Other economists will pay attention to it. They might actually like try to build off your research and do more research related to it. And that's why Noah Smith, he's the writer of that article, just focused on the top journals. He said, just look at these top econ journals and how many of them have published anything that had to do with climate change. It's like remember what it is, 0.0 something percent. Very small. And that's what he means when he's not saying nobody's doing research on the climate. He's saying the best economists publishing in the best journals are not. And I agree with that point. Even though I also agree with what you said, Philip, which is that individual people actually they do care about this problem, and they do want to teach their undergraduate students about it. I'm teaching you right now. I care about it, but I'm not doing research on it, am I? And I think that's part of his problem. He also doesn't like the guy who won the Nobel Prize for it. There's a guy called Nordhaus. I'm not even exactly sure how to pronounce his name, but I think it's Nordhaus, and he won a Nobel Prize in, was it 2018, largely for this studying the jointly economic growth and climate change, climate catastrophe stuff. So, you can check out William Nordhaus's Nobel Prize winning papers and the lecture that he gave about it. And right there, that might be something you would respond to Noah Smith saying, hey, of course, there are people doing this. One guy even won the Nobel Prize. But he's saying that model actually isn't the right model. Like he's got the guy who won the Nobel Prize for studying climate change in economics will like admit that he didn't look into some of the tail and the fat tails, the small probability things, but if they do happen, they're catastrophic. And just essentially the guy, Noah Smith, the author of the paper, says it's not even the right model. We shouldn't be giving Nobel Prizes to these types of climate change models. We should be looking more at what the climate scientists are doing and less of what the economists are doing. So, I'm not an expert in this area, but a lot of what he said, I sort of do agree with, that there are these problems of academia that lead to this situation where climate economics has quote unquote failed us. Nick, you had your hand up for a while. Do you want to say something?
Sorry, I just kind of left that up. I was thinking like maybe it's hard to quantify or like do economic research on stuff like this. Maybe not hard to do, but it involves more degrees of separation than just looking at purely economic phenomena and having the economic effects. Because like, remember there was a guy I knew who did his like PhD paper on the effects of climate change on political instability. And like when you have political instability, since government's a large part of most developed countries' GDP, that can have like larger effects down the line. So it's almost like a tertiary effect where you're making not just one level of assumptions, but like two, sometimes three.
Yeah, I agree. I also, what you said made me think of this fact that there's no data for the future. Economists are great with working with data. They're some of the best data scientists out there. Like you wanted to work on data science for some reason, hire an economist. Their skills that they have will be good for whatever you need to do. But when you're talking about the future, this is about prediction. This is about forecasting. And economists, actually, they're not that great at forecasting. Nobody is, right? There's too much. You can sort of say, well, I want to create a model that will forecast the future, and I've put everything in it. The more you put into it, there's of course this trade-off between I'm using all of this data to make this one little prediction, and is it out of sample or in sample? And so we don't publish papers about that, about forecasting, really. We publish papers about data that's in the past, explaining something that's already happened. That's what economists are really good at. And so this question of climate change, what's the future going to be like if we allow carbon emissions to stay at their current level for the next 100 years, or all of that, we're not experts in. And even the climate scientists you create a model about that, but it's really just a prediction. We don't know for sure. There's too much uncertainty about the future to know exactly what will happen if we have the Paris Agreement that says cut carbon emissions by like 50%. If we ignore that and just leave it at 100%, or if we go even further down to 10%, it's really hard to predict what the future is going to be. And that's another reason why we don't write papers and publish them in great journals, because it's almost impossible to do that, in my opinion. But what about the carbon tax? So if you read this paper, he talks about the carbon tax and how it's actually a bad idea. What do you guys think about the carbon tax? So we're going to have a debate next week. Next week, we'll talk about cap and trade for carbon emissions, which is basically like a carbon tax, only there's a market regulation to determine the price of carbon rather than just the government setting the price of carbon. When I say the price of carbon, I mean like how much do you have to pay per unit of carbon emissions? A carbon tax it's just fixed. Everybody has to pay the same amount. And a cap and trade system says, well, you don't have to pay a tax for the carbon, but you do only have a certain amount of permits of a level that you can emit. If you want to go above that, you have to buy permits. And the way you get permits is from other people who sell them to you. And the price of that, the price of those permits is kind of like a tax on your carbon. So fundamentally, I think those are very similar things. And you might think, why does this guy Noah Smith, why is he against it? You probably haven't gotten this far, Philip. Are you still reading through that paper? Or did you stop? What do you guys think?
I just got to the carbon part.
Okay. Do you want to know what I think? This is my opinion. I was asked at one point if I wanted to give my name as a co-signer of a petition that supported the carbon tax, and it listed economists, and there were hundreds of economists from all over the country, like all over the universities. I think there were 5 people at VCU signed it. I was one of the 5. And it was supporting a carbon tax. And I said, yes, I agree with this. But I don't, I think it's better than not having one. If the choices are carbon tax or nothing, I think taxes are good ways to stop people from causing externalities. You don't want them to produce no carbon. That would be stupid. If we said that we're banning all carbon emissions, that would be really stupid. I don't want to do that. A carbon tax is somewhere in between, saying we're not banning this thing, but we are going to make you pay a tax the more you do of it. And that is one way that's relatively standoffish. What's the word? It doesn't interfere too much with people's natural production choices, and it can reduce carbon emissions. And if the climate scientists are right, we don't know, reducing carbon emissions is an important part of making life and sustainable on Earth in the far future. So that's why I signed it. But guys like the author of this paper say it's actually a bad idea because it doesn't cause us to transition fast enough to some new technology, some new way of doing things. In fact, private markets really aren't going to do it at all. It's got to, maybe I'm paraphrasing or incorrectly paraphrasing what he's saying, but I think his reasoning was, we need a very bold initiative to get us to where we need to go, rather than just these nudges to try to make businesses change the way they produce things on their own. And I sort of agree with that too. Like, yeah, it's true that nudging businesses to produce things in a more clean way is going to only get you so far. And, you know, I just didn't think that because of that, we shouldn't do the carbon tax at all. And that's why I put my name on that thing. But, you know, that's just my opinion. Nick, do you have a point? Do you have a question or comment?
I haven't read up to the point in the paper, but I guess like I can understand how maybe you'd be against the idea of a carbon tax because you don't believe it would provide enough of a positive incentive to move towards renewables. But I mean, I guess hypothetically, you could use the revenue from the carbon tax to fund tax credits to companies that switch over to renewables, and that would provide like a positive and a negative reinforcement to the behavior.
Yeah, we did this in an exercise, actually. We did this in an exercise. You weren't there, Nick, but we did it on Tuesday. And oh, he calls it the carbon tax fetish. Ooh, that hurts. That hurts me, Noah Smith. I actually wanted to @ him on Twitter. It was like, hey, Noah Smith, I want you to come to my class and talk to my students. And then I chickened out. He's got like 1 million followers, so I don't want to do that. It was in the hundreds of thousands. Let me share this article with you just for right now. Right. He calls it the carbon tax fetish. Can you see the article? It's on your screens, right?
Yeah, I just finished reading that part. I'm understanding where his logic for it's coming. Like he's saying it's like a limited thing and it relies on, if you like, it talked about Washington doing it,
Yeah,
but failed overwhelmingly because of a free rider effect where Washington's doing it, but no one else is doing it. It's not going to have any effect.
Oh, totally. I agree with that. If you're like the only state that imposes a carbon tax, and then right across the Columbia River in Oregon, they're not, businesses can just move to Oregon and save themselves the carbon tax. So I totally agree with that. But like when he calls it a carbon tax fetish, that's not what it is. It's not a fetish. I mean, I have some understanding of what the word fetish is, and I don't think that applies to the way economists feel about carbon taxes. I signed this petition. I'm just some, associate professor of economics at VCU. Nobody cares about me. but I did add my name to this petition that was basically maybe like Joe Biden and the other major people in policymaking. It's meant to say that the economics community does support doing something about climate change. If it's a carbon tax, that's what we should do. It's better than nothing. I really didn't mean for it to say just do a carbon tax and then you're done. You can check off the climate change box in your policy initiatives and go on to something else. That is not what I meant. And I'm guessing that's not what other people who signed it meant. And
Yeah.
so I think it's a little misleading. Go ahead.
We're talking about the political infeasibility of it right now. Like it failed 59-40 in the state of Washington, which is a pretty liberal state, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it is.
It was just, it's not politically feasible right now, on top of the fact that it's limited when it's only, let's say that's one state, even if just the entire United States does it.
Right.
Most of the carbon in the world, like the growth of carbon, like production in the world is from like countries that don't have, like,
I think it's India
now than we were in the past.
Yeah, I think it's India right now.
More than they were in the past. Like I think China's just, it's
And
exploded.
China. Of course, I totally agree. And you know what? That's a legitimate concern. If the United States is the only country that's going to impose a carbon tax and the other ones don't, it will have a much smaller effect. And you could argue maybe it's not even worth it if we're the only country doing it. But if we could do it as a globe, wouldn't that be pretty nice? If we could have some sort of international agreement that says every country needs to reduce their carbon emissions by 50% in the next 30 years, which is pretty much what we had with the Paris Agreement. If every country signed on to that and then actually went through and did it, then I sort of believe that would be a good thing. There are some businesses that would be hurt though. That it's absolutely, this isn't going to be fair in the sense of treating everybody the same. There's certain industries, particularly those that produce a lot of carbon emissions, that are going to be really damaged by this. And I think that's really a big reason why it's not politically going to be popular. People don't like when the government is interfering in the profitability of an entire industry. They just don't like it. And yeah, failing in Washington is a pretty bad sign that it would fail on the whole United States.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So suppose it's already been done with the Paris Climate Accord, but suppose we come back together, the world signs on to an accord, how would it be enforced?
Very good question. That's the $1 million question. And the answer is nobody knows.
Because I don't think countries, like major countries, would be in their best interest to tell the truth about if they're really following the accords.
So you're talking about whether we can enforcement in the terms of inspections and being able to tell what their true emissions are. That's not what I'm worried about. I would be worried about a country saying, now we just don't want to do it. Like they say they're going to do it, but they don't. And sovereignty is a very, very important issue for every country. Once they lose their sovereignty, they've lost something very important to them. And this is part of the reason why the European Union never really panned out to be as strong as people would have hoped, because ultimately every country in the European Union doesn't want to give up its sovereignty. And that means the right to make its own decisions and do what it wants. And that's what makes enforcement so hard of these international agreements. To really, this maybe I sound like I'm contradicting myself saying, yeah, we need an international organization to reduce our carbon emissions, but if at the same time it's not enforceable, how do we do it? We would have to think of some way, maybe it's self-enforcing in some way. What self-enforcing means is that you have to change the incentives of the people in the organization so that they're better off doing what they're supposed to do. And that is possible. That is possible in some ways, to make a treaty or an accord self-enforcing. And it may have to do with some sort of economic transfer payments or benefits that only certain countries get and others don't get for some reason. But it is a great question and a very hard question to answer. You can see the CO2 emissions here. Did you guys know they've been going down in the United States? As we've adopted slightly cleaner technologies, not like, we have electric cars, but we still have a lot of gasoline fueled cars. I own 2 of them. I have 2 gasoline fueled cars. So you might think, well, this guy must not really care about the environment. I went shopping for a Tesla this winter, and we were very close to buying one. But man, they're expensive, and also you need a nice electric port to put them in, and a nice garage to have it in, and we don't have that yet. So yes, I am a bit of a hypocrite in the fact that I have 2 gasoline fueled cars. But look, the US is going down. There's this orange one. China, whoa, went way up here. It's sort of cooled off a little bit lately, but still this giant jump in the annual CO2 emissions of China. India is going to be rising for a long time, we think, too. Their population is actually growing faster than China's, and probably not too long in the future, India will be the world's largest country in terms of population as well. But anyways, the free rider problem, I'm glad that he mentioned it, because it's something we should all, this is an economics class. I'm teaching an economics class right now. One of the very most important things in economics, when you're talking about environmental problems, is the free rider problem. It's pretty much the same as the tragedy of the commons. It's a little bit different, but I would say the free rider problem is more general. But I do want you to know what that is. I know what the free rider problem is, where you could do, let's say you're the United States and you drop your CO2 emissions to like way down here, 10% of what they were at their peak. Let's say you do that, but all these other countries just either stay the same or go up, then we won't have solved this global problem of climate change. We won't have solved it. And that's a very good point. And I think the biggest issue that we face as a species over the next 100 years is, how do we get every country to manage and reduce their CO2 emissions? Not just your country. How do we get every country to do it? It's going to be difficult, very difficult. Okay. The Peugeot Club. Do you know why Greg Mankiw called it the Peugeot Club? Have you heard of the pig? I still don't know how to pronounce it. It's French. Is it Peugeot or Peugeot? Peugeot. Pigouvian taxes. I do know that's what it's called. A Pigouvian tax, like this carbon tax, it's meant to internalize an external cost in the form of a tax. Okay, that's what a Pigouvian tax is. And you should think of the cap and trade, which we'll debate, as another form of a Pigouvian tax, in the form of you have to buy these carbon permits. I want to show you, I'll show you in a graph later in this lecture. Man, I'm used a lot of time here, but I'll show you a graph later in this lecture that shows exactly why economists believe Pigouvian taxes can be very useful in creating an efficient outcome where there otherwise would be a market failure. If you remember, first week of class, second week of class, a market failure is not when the market ceases to exist. That's where the market fails to meet buyers and sellers. That's not what it means. A market failure is any time an efficient outcome is not achieved using the market. It seems like that happens a lot, doesn't it? Yeah, that's called a market failure. And an externality is a very simple way that we can cause a market failure. And I would think maybe carbon emissions are an example of a negative externality. And a carbon tax is the standard economic way of a Pigouvian tax to get rid of the externalities. Just make people pay, don't ban the thing, say you're not allowed to emit any carbon. Don't say that. That would be ridiculous. Just say you also have to pay for the externality that you're imposing. You have to pay for, you're producing something, you're producing a car. Of course, you have to pay for the materials that produced that car, but you also have to pay a tax equal to the emissions that car will give, or that, producing the car, you caused some negative externalities, and you have to pay for them in terms of this Pigouvian tax. So let's talk about this a little bit more in the form of my lecture slides. Sorry about that. And that is here. Also under Blackboard, if you go to Common Pool Resources and Externalities, I will show you. Gosh, I've gotten you all revved up to talk about externalities. Maybe I should skip right to the externalities and we'll come back to the Common Pool Resources. Here's, I think am I sharing the right thing? Not anymore. Common Pool Resources and Externalities is the name of this PowerPoint slide. Here we are at slideshow, current slide. Okay. It's a market failure because buyers and the sellers in the market do not take into consideration the negative effects on others, just by definition. What do we mean when we say social cost? That includes the pecuniary cost of the production. Pecuniary just means monetary, the thing that you can measure in dollars. The pecuniary cost of production, as well as the external costs. The external costs are the things that the people who aren't involved in this transaction have to pay. Not literally pay, but they just, they suffer some kind of cost. Those are called the external costs. So let's call, when we add those together, the pecuniary cost of production and the external costs, we'll call that the social cost, or the social cost curve. The pecuniary marginal costs are given by the supply curve. That's what a supply curve is, if you remember. Supply curve basically says, on the margin, would I be willing to sell one more unit of this good? If so, the supply curve goes up by one. It gives you exactly how many units you would like to produce at a given cost. And the answer to that question, how many should you produce? It's up until the costs are equal to the marginal cost. The price is equal to the marginal cost. That's where you should stop. That's why the marginal cost curve is given by the supply curve. Next bullet point, you can shift the supply curve up by the per unit external costs. In fact, if you're talking about the social cost, it's really just a shift up, isn't it? You can draw a supply curve. You can draw a supply curve, and that same supply curve should be shifted up by whatever the per unit external costs of the externality are. And that gives you what's called the social cost curve. Okay, so you have a supply curve, that's the real monetary curve. You shift it up, that's the social cost curve. And now you have two places where it intersects the demand curve. The demand curve is downward sloping, but you have two different supply curves. And those 2 points represent, the 2 points of intersection represent two different things. The one further to the right is the free market level of production, which in itself is inefficient because of the externality. It doesn't represent the points where the total benefit is maximized in society because it's ignoring the external costs. Whereas the other point of intersection is called the socially efficient level of production, because it's where the demand meets the shifted supply curve, which is also the social cost curve. I have this graph for you on the next slide, so I'm not going to just talk about a bunch of terms without showing you a graph. I'm going to show you a graph. Here it is. So hopefully this makes sense, given what I just said in words. This is what it looks like in pictures. So this downward sloping curve, it's called the marginal private benefit curve on this graph, but it's actually the demand curve, right? That's exactly what demand is. It's the marginal private benefit to consuming this thing. This rightmost upward sloping curve is called the marginal private cost curve, but that's really the supply curve. That's what we know of as the supply curve, because that's exactly how much a firm would like to produce at given each price, is whatever its marginal private cost is. And then this leftmost upward sloping curve, marginal social cost, that's the social cost curve. And the argument is Q2 is efficient and Q1 is not. Everyone see that? Q1 is the free market price and quantity that would be achieved, whereas Q2 is and P2 is the socially optimal price and quantity. You guys have any questions about that? Why that's the case? The answer why that's the case is because it's only this top blue curve that factors in the externality. The bottom one doesn't. And if you're talking about what's efficient, I would say you need to include the externality, because there are real people out there who are having those costs. And assuming you care about those people too, that's why Q2 is the efficient one. Now, it's not to say the quantity should be zero. Agreed? If you produce, let's say the government stepped in and said, we're going to ban production of this thing. It's no longer legal to produce any of it. So this quantity will go all the way to zero. If that happens, I kind of would like to annotate now. If we say now the quantity has to be zero, this is where marginal social cost is, and this is where marginal private benefit is. Look at this huge loss here, all the way from this top one to this. This would be the trade surplus that we're giving up by banning this particular good, and there's no reason to do it. Even when considering the social cost of the external costs, there's so much benefit that's being gained by it that we as a society would be losing a lot if this good were banned and had to produce zero of it. Actually, there's a lot to be said about this level at Q2. We're still getting all of the private costs that are, private benefits that, like, the people who really love to consume this thing, they're getting a lot. They're getting that triangle here. The firms that are making it, they're getting some profit too. But of course, right now is where I should clear my drawings and talk to you exactly about what's called the Pigouvian tax. What does a Pigouvian tax do? It charges the firms, well, it doesn't matter if it's the firms or the producers, exactly equal to this distance here between P2 and right here. This distance becomes a tax. Okay, so man, I'd like to use some like drawing where I could draw in a lot of area at once. I don't know if I can. All right, I'll do red. This red triangle here, that becomes what's called consumer surplus. It's all the benefit that consumers get by having this product. They only have to pay P2 for it, but they're getting some benefit to it, which is greater than P2. And this area represents the total benefit of their consumer surplus. What about producer surplus? Okay, well, they're selling it for P2, but they don't get P2, do they? They actually have to pay this tax between P2 and this black line here. They have to pay that as a tax, but they're still getting a profit. They're getting everything below that, this blue triangle here. I wish I could fill in the triangles somehow, but I'm not sure if the annotate feature of Zoom is capable of that. But this blue triangle represents the producer surplus that they're getting, the profits that they're earning by existing in this market. And what about the remaining triangle here? Those are proceeds, they're tax revenues that go to the government, right? This green rectangle are the tax revenues that go to the government, because Q2 units of this product are being sold, and this right here is the tax. It's the per unit tax. It's a Pigouvian tax. And remember, Pigouvian just means it's a tax which internalizes the cost, the external cost of the production, so that the firms on their own will choose Q2 as their level of production and not Q1. So because I'm an economist and I've seen this graph a million times, I think that's partially why I signed on to the whole carbon tax thing. It's like, well, yeah, it sort of makes sense. If there's an externality, you want to fix the externality, you can do that with a tax. But I will definitely admit that there are circumstances where this model doesn't tell you the whole story. It doesn't say, what if we could produce things this way, or we could completely change the way we're producing it into some other way. You know, you could think of like high-speed trains versus airplanes as a way to get across the country. You want to go from here to Seattle, you got to take an airplane. That's really the only feasible way to do it. It just takes so long to drive. Even driving wouldn't be good for the environment, but you can think of like a radical change where now there's high-speed trains, and they're somehow do it using electricity, but not a lot of electricity. Therefore, it's better for the environment. There's less external cost. You could think of that as a sort of radical change in production that a Pigouvian tax wouldn't really impose, at least in my opinion. A Pigouvian tax is more of a nudge, is like a reduction in production, but not a causing you to completely change the way you produce the thing in the first place. So maybe that's why Noah Smith doesn't like it. But still, I don't have a fetish for it. I have to say that I do not have a fetish for these sorts of taxes. Okay. You guys have any questions about what a Pigouvian tax is? It's a per unit tax on production equal to the external cost at the socially optimal level. Right, that's another key. It shouldn't be at any other level. If you chose it like this distance between here and here, it wouldn't necessarily get you the right outcome. It's got to be right here between this part of the demand curve and this part on the supply curve at the socially optimal level. Okay. I'm going to clear my drawings. They're great drawings, and they're okay drawings, but I'm going to clear them. Next slide. Yeah, here's some examples. You guys don't need to know examples of externalities. Pollution, like Philip said, is the simplest example people give. In this class, we're going to talk about greenhouse gas emissions. It's not just carbon dioxide, it's methane. Oftentimes, you just sort of lump them together to call them carbon emissions, but that's true. Did you guys know antibiotic usage is an example of an externality? What's the externality in that case? You use a lot of antibiotics, or you give sorry, what?
Antibiotic resistant bugs.
Yeah, that's a cost that everybody else has to pay. Let's say you raise pigs in Oklahoma, and you have a farm, and you just give all these pigs all these antibiotics. You're doing that because it makes sense for you that it increases your profits. But the external cost is creating superbugs that cause other people's livestock to be in danger, and then it can even transfer to humans, where the viruses become, oh no, sorry, it's bacteria, it's not viruses. Bacteria become more resistant and more dangerous because of it, and that's the cost. Even if it's an expected cost, it's still a cost. Okay, I don't need to explain these. Did you guys know vaccinations can be an example of a positive externality? Why is a vaccination a positive externality, not a negative one? A vaccination is a decision between you and the person who's offering you the vaccine. No, you're the first
The
party,
transmission rate.
you're the second party. Who's the third party who's getting a benefit? Is that Charlotte who's talking?
Yes, that was me. I said it reduces transmission rate. So the rate of transmission goes down, and that's a benefit to everybody.
Exactly. So the external, the reason it's an externality is because there's somebody else out there who's not you, who is getting a little bit more protected from this disease because you've chosen to get a vaccination. Oh, I love bees too. Bees are great examples of positive externalities that people don't understand or realize, that so much of fruit in this country, in the world, has to be pollinated by a bee. And if you are a beekeeper, like let's say you want to sell honey, so you have some bees and you just have bees on your property to make honey, you are causing a great positive externality on any fruit farmers within like several miles of you, because the bees will go pollinate and your fruit will be much better. And it's a positive externality that often gets ignored, but it exists. But in this class, I think we'll be speaking more about the negative externalities. And what do you do for externality? If you're an economist, what would you suggest? What's your policy? Internalize the externality somehow. Make it so that the person who's making the decision is forced to think about the externality that they cause. That's the solution. I say that as a guy who I'm realizing that it almost seems like I'm trying to indoctrinate you guys in the same way of thinking that led me to think that carbon taxes are the solution to the climate crisis, when perhaps they're not. So take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. They're not always the solution, right? Pigouvian taxes might be nice, but they're not always the solution, I guess. Here's one thing: government provision. That sounds awful if you are afraid of socialism or communism. And I am a person who does not support either socialism or communism. But if there is an industry where there is this unavoidable negative externality being caused, and you're trying to think of a way to stop it, it might be that the simplest way is to say, okay, we're just going to have the government provide this thing and not private industries, because the government should take into consideration the externalities and the private companies won't. And the final bullet point here are some free market solutions. When I say free market, I shouldn't have said free, I just said market solutions, because it's not totally free. If you're putting a cap and trade on carbon, then already I'd say it's not free. There's some restrictions on the market, but is it worth it to talk a little bit more about a cap and trade system, since we're going to have this debate? The people who are debating it, are you here? I'm going to stop sharing. I'm sorry, I forget who's scheduled to debate, but next class we're scheduled to have a debate about the cap and trade system. Jacob, you're one of them?
Yeah.
You think you're ready for this debate? Are you for or against?
I'm for.
Okay, so you're going to argue that we should impose a cap on all businesses. This is not about individuals now. I just want everyone to know, we're not talking about you as an individual, your right to, produce carbon emissions. If you want to drive your car, 100,000 miles every year and not worry about the emissions, I guess you're free to do that. We're not talking about that. We're talking about 100,000 miles a year would be awful. Nobody would want to drive that much. We're talking about businesses and whether or not they have the right to emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, or whether they have to obtain permits to do that. In a cap and trade system, you would have a certain amount where you could emit and you're allowed to. Basically, that's like the cap. You have these a flat line, but if you want to do more than that, you can. You just need to negotiate a trade with some other company who's not using their full limit, and they can trade with you. And the idea is there are some companies who are probably going to find great ways to lower their carbon emissions, and we want to incentivize them to do that a lot. That says if you lower your carbon emissions by a lot, not only is it, you might have reasons to do that, but then you can profit by selling your permits to other companies who haven't found a way to lower their carbon emissions, and they just want to bite the bullet and pay for the carbon permits. It's a way to sort of increase the flexibility, you might say, of the firms. To say not everyone has to completely lower their carbon emissions to some really, really small amount. Some will be able to do that, and maybe others won't. And you can work it out amongst yourselves as to exactly how far you'll go. And that's what hopefully Jacob will argue for. So someone will argue against it. And who is it? Jack? No. So the person arguing against it, I'm going to allow you to decide on your own what you think is wrong with it. You could say it's not going far enough, kind of like Noah Smith. Or you could say it's not the best way to achieve the goals of reducing carbon emissions. I guess I might allow you to say that, right? You can say what you want, but here's what I would like. I would not like you to say, is it Jack, by the way? Who's arguing against? I forget. Do I need to look it up? I'll look it up if I have to. Why didn't I just look it up? If I go to course documents, it's the first one, debate schedule. It is Samuel. Oh, he's not here, is he? You hear Samuel? Darn. All right, I'm gonna try to talk to Samuel. So this really only applies to him, but I just don't want him to claim that climate change is a hoax, right? That would be stupid. It would be a waste of all of our time if that if somebody thought that there's no point in reducing carbon emissions because they have no effect on the environment and everything will be fine regardless of what we do. That would be a pretty weird belief to have in 2021, but I'll talk to him privately. That doesn't affect you guys. Okay, what else can I help you with? I did skip I skipped the common pool resource. Do you mind if I go back and talk about that? I'm sorry I'm talking so much. We had two great exercises, I think, with the negative externalities. We had an exercise where people chose a level of carbon production which was much higher than the socially efficient level. By the way, Philip and I stuck around afterwards and we worked it out. It was 15. 15 was the socially optimal level of carbon production. And the average was roughly, and I had you choose a number between 0 and 100, how much carbon production you wanted to have. And the average was about 50, both in the first time. And then the second time, I allowed you to have a carbon tax. The higher the carbon tax, the less incentive you had to produce in a more carbon intensive way. And the carbon taxes were either 50% or 30%. One group chose 30, the other group chose 50%. Of course, the group with 50% had much lower carbon levels than the one with 30%. Incidentally, the one with 30% actually went up over not having a carbon tax. But the one with the 50% carbon tax saw their carbon production emissions go down like almost by half, not quite half. They still didn't reach the efficient level though. The efficient level was 15 and they were somewhere like 30. But that was a great exercise. I appreciate everybody who did that. And two classes ago, we had a tragedy of the commons exercise, where the tragedy was people were catching too many whales, even though you did a relatively good job not catching the whales all right away. There was a perhaps even more efficient way to allow the whales to live a little longer. So what I want to do now, I only have like 8 minutes left. Ooh, 7 minutes. I love talking about this stuff. Maybe I do have a no, I don't have fetish. So the example I want to give you right now is cows. It's cows in on a field of grass. Can somebody? Oh, by the way, are you seeing the right thing? Are you seeing the example of the tragedy of the commons slide right now?
Yes.
Great. From current slide, it won't go. Zoom slideshow. No. You're seeing it. Tragedy of the commons. In this example, you can either purchase a steer, that's a cow, for $100 and let it graze on these common lands for a year. And the value of the steer depends on the number of steers on the land. Because the more steers that are on the land, the less grass is available. The good grass gets eaten, and they have to go farther to find grass. And actually, the value of a steer can go down after a year if too many people graze on the commons. So the question is, what's the socially? Let's ask the first question. What would happen if every rancher wants to make money? It's laissez-faire. Laissez-faire means there's no government intervention into what happens here. Can somebody answer what would happen in the laissez-faire outcome where there's 8 ranchers and they're all independently deciding whether to buy a steer for $100? How many steers would get purchased? And we have an answer? You understand the question? It's the maximum is 8. How many of the ranchers would buy a steer if they all just want to make money and they know it costs $100 to buy a steer? I can't tell if you guys, oh. Do you understand the question? There's very little time here. If nobody answers, we're not gonna... 6. 6 is correct. Why is it 6? Because, you know, the first, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the 6th steer will get purchased. The 7th steer will not get purchased because that would just be losing money. You would lose $1 on the steer. So yeah, you could argue that 6 of these steers will be purchased, and the value of those 6 will go up by $2, and the other 2 ranchers won't get anything. Is that socially optimal or efficient? No. What would be the socially optimal or efficient thing to do? Can anyone tell? Math, there's some math here. Because of a lack of time, I may just have to tell you. You know what the socially optimal thing to do here is? You want to guess? How many steers? You want to maximize the total surplus of in the economy. How many steers should there be on these commons eating the grass? If you buy one that's earning like a profit of 50 or surplus of 50, you get 2, there's a surplus of 80. You get 3, there's a surplus of 90. 4, surplus is only 65. So the answer is 3, right? You see what I'm saying? Maybe you don't. The reason 3 is the socially optimal number of steers is because that maximizes the total surplus gained from the steers eating the grass in the common areas. That would be the efficient thing to do. There should only be 3 cows eating the grass. But if it's the tragedy of the commons is that instead of 3 cows eating the grass, there are 6 cows eating the grass. And the 6 cows have to struggle to find the good grass, and they don't actually increase their size, and it's inefficient. Okay, you just have to take my word for it. Hopefully you understand that. But now is where I want to make, my last point of the day, which is that property rights are such a great thing in economics. Economists love property rights. It's one of the earliest things that economic philosophy has given to the world. Is you want economic prosperity, first establish property rights and establish the rules of institutions like governments and markets that can help you build on that prosperity. But first you got to have property rights. Okay, in this example, being able to control who can be on the commons and who can't, it'd be a really valuable thing. One thing you could do is sell grazing permits for $16. What if you did that? You said, okay, I know you want to buy a cow and you want that cow to be able to graze on these common grounds, but if you do that, you have to pay us $16. This is a Pareto improvement. If you use the money generated from these grazing permits to give at all anything back to the 5 ranchers at all, the 5 ranchers who don't buy cows to put on the grazing land, let me just show you why. Once again, last point here. The 3 ranchers who pay the grazing permits, they're still going to make money. They're going to make $30 on their cow. They have to pay $16 for the grazing permit, but they still get to keep $14 as profit, pure profit. The other ranchers, the ones who chose not to buy a cow and put it on the common grounds, well, they're getting some benefit too from the grazing permits somehow being used to enrich themselves in a mutually beneficial way. And it's by establishing these grazing permit rights, property rights in the sense, like you have the right to use the common grounds and you don't, taking away the fact that they're literally common grounds and establishing these rights is a way to get this economy to an efficient level. And that is the last point I wanted to make. So I talked a lot about what can we do to solve the problem of negative externalities, Pigouvian taxes, etc. This is my answer to, according to me, the best way to solve the problem of the tragedy of the commons. What's the best way to solve the tragedy of the commons? Somehow establish rights to who can use the commons or who can't. Make them pay for it. Make them pay for the right to use it. And that will stop people from overusing it, right? You don't want people to overuse the commons. You want them to use it just the right way. Same thing with the whaling experiment. If you had some way to make people pay for the whales that they were catching, then people wouldn't catch too many whales. You would be able to control the number of whales they catch. Okay, I think I'm done. You guys have any comments or questions? 6. Oh, you were answering the question. Sorry, Jerron. I didn't see you. So we're going to have 2 debates next week. Both of them on carbon emissions. Actually, no, the second one is about the Green New Deal. Second one is going to be about the Green New Deal, which is more of a radical change in the way we do things in this country, as opposed to the cap and trade, was probably a little bit more of a gradual change in the way we do things. At least that's how I think about it. But yeah, you'll have summaries due. The first one, cap and trade, on Tuesday. The second one, the Green New Deal, on Thursday. Gosh, I'm sorry I didn't talk more about the Green New Deal. Maybe at the end of class Tuesday, we can talk a little bit about it so that you're ready for your homework about it on Thursday. Also, don't forget you have a paper. Hopefully you're working on your term paper. You've decided on what your topic is going to be